Hello and welcome to this video on the Melange of Dune.
Spice. It's in everything here.
In this series, the most essential and perhaps most valuable commodity, if you look at the political situation, is melange. This is a violet-coloured drug, and it extends the lifespan of the person who takes it, increases their vitality, makes them more aware of their environment, and in some cases, such as some of the lead characters, can give prescience. That is if taken in a large enough quantity. For the most part, it simply provides the longer lifespan and greater vitality. This property, let's say, is used both in the interstellar travel, which is facilitated by the Navigators, and by the Bene Gesserit. It's also possible that it is a very powerful mutagen. Melange is, as a consequence of all this, incredibly addictive, and withdrawal is generally likely to be fatal. In order to get melange, the harvesters must contend with the giant sandworms of Arrakis, creatures that are monumental in size and easily capable of consuming the harvesting vehicles whole. One quote reads, "The spice had glowed radiant blue in the dim silver light, and the smell, bitter cinnamon, unmistakable." Melange can be processed to create things like spice paper, fibre, and even chemical explosives. It can be refined to create spice essence and gas. Altogether, this is quite a lot to take in, but we will endeavour to describe it with just a small amount of prospective speculation where needed. It should be noted that some of the lore is contradictory or unclear at times. Let's start with the generation of the melange to start with. As with Earth, where there are plants and animals that generate drugs, Arrakis has its giant sandworms. The sandworm is monstrously sized, some being 80 meters in diameter and 400 meters in length, there being others yet again that are longer and wider. The worm itself is interesting. It appears to grow from an individual sand trout, which is a small creature that agglomerates around water. These eventually become the sandworm itself, and they grow in size over time. When the worms die, the trout are freed from within it. The trout itself seems to be what secretes the fungal melange. The melange is produced deep under the sands, presumably in pockets where there's water. It's created where the sand trout secretes the fungal melange as a waste product, and this is mixed with water. This mixing with water creates what is called a pre-spice mass. This mass then rises to the surface, and through an explosive process, including pressure and intense heat, the melange is formed. As noted, the sand trout themselves appear to not only be able to do this, but form the worm itself, and they are released from the worm when it dies. At a physiological level, how the worms create melange would need to be similar to the animals on Earth. Melange is created as an excretion of the sandworm trout, reacting with water and sunlight, but the sand trout itself is described as being flat, leathery, and roughly diamond-shaped. They have no head, extremities, or eyes, really only having a coarse layer of interlacing cilia over the top of them, but they seem to also have the ability to find water without fail. Strangely though, they produce a sweet green syrup. When you look at the sand trout secretion and you combine it with water, that's the pre-spice mass. But that's also described as a fungal growth. And it's interesting, you have both a fungal growth and an animal involved. The fact that it still needs sunlight to change after the combination of animal secretion and water, which creates a pressure gradient, and then the sunlight to further change it, makes it an even more complicated issue. Individually though, it can't be thought that the sand trout are able to produce a lot of melange by themselves. It's said that millions of them die each time a spice blow occurs. They're also very prone to dying with a small degree in weather change. Only a few degrees Celsius needs to be shifted for the sand trout to die. In our world, there are a few possible immediate candidates that are similar to Melange in some ways. The first and obvious are fungi. Most probably symbiotic fungi like truffles. This would fit with the dual form we see with Melange. There are the worms and trout, and the precursor format that brings. The fact that they're needed to then convert whatever's being generated into the Melange. Truffles have a similar symbiotic relationship with certain species of tree, where they provide a mutually beneficial exchange. This theory is somewhat undermined by the development of Ultra Spice in the last Dune book, whereby altering the DNA of the sand trout, they could create a purely aquatic form of the worm, and this is able to adapt to an entirely aquatic environment and create what was called Ultra Spice, a much more concentrated form of spice. For this video, we'll just focus on the original Melange. Assuming that it's possible to create it, and the entry in the Dune Encyclopedia is accurate, it has 4 main sections. We've labelled them 1 through 4 in this image. The first is very similar to maltose. 2 glucose molecules bound together via an oxygen bond. They appear to be affected by a Maillard reaction, as there are amine groups. Chemically, the amine group is similar to acetanolide, and this is used as a varnish stabilizer, analgesic, and antipyretic. The second is a long carbon chain very similar to lysine. Lysine is one of the basic amino acids. The third is a single carbon ring. It has double bonds on each side, which are both rigid bonds. This keeps the products on each side of the molecule in place, where they can only rotate on a horizontal axis, while single bonds would move freely. The downside to a double bond like this is that it is somewhat more difficult to break. The fourth and final is a complex structure of 4 6-carbon rings and 4 5-carbon rings, which form a roughly symmetrical square. From this juts out a sulfur-bonded methanol group, which is arguably part of its own structure, and over all this part of the molecule, it is very similar to oxyhemocyanin. This is what shellfish use instead of hemoglobin to carry oxygen around their body. The methyl and sulfur group is highly flammable, which could be exactly what lets the Fremen make explosives from it. The fourth group looks very much like oxyhemocyanin, which makes sense if it's generated by the water-loving sand trout. It would also be an effective way for the sand trout and later worms to be able to sustain their life. It's logical to have such a novel approach for a large subterranean creature. After all, the environment they live within appears to be in many ways similar to being in an aquatic environment. On top of all of this, everything they've created is carbon-based. This means your general rules about organic chemistry apply. In fact, it is an organic molecule. There appears to be only one position within it that has any kind of unusual products, and that's the copper in what looks to be like the oxyhemocyanin. With all of this, let's look at what it does and possibly how. Melange is said to provide a longer lifespan and greater vitality. A diet rich in melange is said to triple the average human's lifespan. That would make it possible to live for up to 250 years or so. This is based on the current average lifespan in a developed country. Part of that may be down to the interventions of the melange at a physiological level. That is, the antihypertensive, anti-seizure, and analgesic effects. Generally speaking, if you're in a position where you can afford to buy melange, chances are you're also in a relatively high-stress occupation, whether that's leading a planet or something similar, where your body's constantly under stress. That stress would have effects such as raising blood pressure, causing neurological defects over time, and eventually causing pain via heart damage and other physical shortcomings. Many of these would be mitigated by the melange itself. In order to live for that long though, it couldn't just have effects that would cover up the byproducts of a rough lifestyle. Rather, it would have to have an impact on the telomeres. Telomeres shorten as someone ages, which in turn increases the risk of cancer. If you are going to live 3 times the average lifespan, the longer you live, the greater the risk of cancer developing becomes, and this isn't a simple linear increase. You can almost look at it as being a compounding effect over time, where early on in life you have relatively little risk. By the time you get to 60 to 70 years of age, you are in the higher risk brackets. This is because the body's cells have had to turn over so frequently that they in turn now have copies of incompatible, inconsistent, or broken genes. Depending on which genes have been copied over, this then turns into cancer. Telomeres are the easiest way to keep the cells going because they ensure that the copies remain intact. Alternatively, it would be possible for the melange to slow down cellular turnover. This would then mitigate to a certain extent the need for the telomeres to be lengthened or have their length retained if someone's able to simply slow down the rate at which that telomere shortening occurs. The cognitive improvements are even less clear-cut than what we've just speculated about. To a degree, the Bene Gesserit and the Navigators of the Guild all need melange, and this is used to expand on their consciousness. It's often described as a psychic action, the Bene Gesserit often being described as psychically gifted, and the most advanced of their members, the Reverend Mothers, use the melange in a high dose to push this even further. The Guild Navigators require the melange in order to be able to navigate from planet to planet. All of these groups rely heavily on both improved cognitive function and, arguably, a higher level of empathy to understand others. This is something we've seen with certain hormones in the human body. Dopamine is a good example, both because of the effect and the chemical structural similarities. Pain is something in the human body that can deplete dopamine levels, and it's also used in the reward and deterrent system. When you do something well, your brain releases dopamine, causing a sense of happiness. When you interact with others, the interaction also involves the release of dopamine. All these things help to wire the brain in such a way that you're able to understand what's going on in others. Not just what's going on though, but set up the brain so that the brain feels like it's doing something right, and so these pathways become stronger. It better facilitates social interactions and understandings. When these pathways become depleted of dopamine, the result is similar to pain, in that the brain starts associating these pathways with something negative and begins to shut them down. Having a higher level of dopamine in the brain allows people to feel compassion and empathy towards others. This is useful in trying to develop attachment and bonding with other people and a development of understanding of them. It's also used in development and reinforcing of pathways for negative experiences, which can also be useful in understanding what others are going through and exhibiting empathy. From this, it is possible that by using a dopamine supplement that could make its way into the brain, you could stimulate a similar response. This same process could also be used to improve neural messaging. This is done by providing a constant supply of dopamine to replace that used during neuronal signaling and lost due to attrition. The challenge would be just how much is needed, not overloading the brain with the supplement, and getting it into the brain. The brain is extremely fussy about what it allows through the blood-brain barrier. Many things simply aren't allowed to pass through. It's why certain medications are extremely difficult to get into the brain to treat certain disorders. It's one of the reasons why you need to gradually administer antidepressants over a period of weeks to reach an adequate and consistent dosing level to have the effect seen in lifting someone's mood. Even when you do reach that level, most of these systems and processes are not known mutagens capable of the changes seen in Dune. The most common sign of high-level and prolonged use of Melange is called the Eyes of the Abad. This is a very simple effect, and it's caused over time. It causes the human eye to change to a completely blue colour. That's something that is unusual to say the least. The effect is something that we can, in theory, attribute to the dye-like properties of part of the melange. This would become deposited in the eyes, which provides the blue coloration seen. But that's only one of the examples. In Dune Messiah, one of the Navigators is described as swimming in a container of orange gas, the tank's vents emitting a pale orange cloud, which had the smell of spice melange to it. We also see something similar in the movie adaptations and early books, where the Navigators are described as living in a tank. They're also described as looking less than normal. Neither of these is exactly normal or viable for a human. Living in a gas tank, assuming you aren't in space and therefore in a vacuum, is generally not something that's going to be beneficial to their health. As with the telomere effect, this would need to affect the DNA. Unlike the telomere effect, it would need to have the opposite outcome by making it less stable. It is possible that the third functional group is just such a molecule as it is similar to an alkylating molecule. These are well-known carcinogens. It is possible, when looking at some of the contents of later books from Dune, that the sand trout themselves, along with the melange, can have these transformative effects on the human body. Although the exact process by which you would go from a human living symbiotically with sand trout to what is seen in the later books is even less clear-cut than simply what melange is by itself. It is clear, though, that it requires incredibly large doses of the spice melange. This might be somewhat fortunate, as withdrawal effects of melange are significantly worse than just about any other drug that we can think of. It practically gives new and literal meaning to the term dependence. The spice has narcotic properties, and consuming small doses leads to an increased demand, although it doesn't appear to be a demand caused by any kind of adaptation to the dose receiving. Rather, it seems to be simply a drive for the positive response associated with taking it in. As someone consumes it, they demand more and more. As we've already noted, the melange may well be causing considerable neurological effects. This would explain much of the observed addictive behaviors. That is, if it is facilitated by dopamine. It would explain how the melange can become incredibly addictive, and possibly how it can be fatal. If the body has a large amount of dopamine being administered to it, it no longer needs manufacture it itself. When it no longer manufactures it itself, and the supply is suddenly cut off, the brain would cease functioning in any manner that's correct, and that would then lead to death. When you combine this effect with the anti-seizure properties that we previously described, it makes sense how melange could be both having an adverse effect that is covered up by its own functional groups, and then by removing it, causing the rather fatal consequences. The fact melange can be converted into so many other products does provide some further clues about the nature and structure. Spice paper, spice fiber, or chemical explosives do not have a lot in common, but there are a few very small things. The two glucose-like molecules on the top of the melange molecule could be used in a manner similar to cellulose. These groups can explain how it functions as a source of fiber and paper, as the structures are similar to cellulose. If it is possible to separate this off and use the oxygen bond to create a series of connections similar to the long cellulose chains, you would be able to create something similar to hemp and other fibers. You would also be able to create something similar to paper, both of which would be effective. Explosives are a somewhat different story and rather more difficult. There are a few out there that might possibly be tangentially related. One is a nitroamine-based explosive, and this would utilize the large grouping at the bottom of the melange, but it would also require considerable modification. A process that would be possible if this is an image of raw melange. A modification that may occur naturally as the melange is described as undergoing a process of conversion to a gas and then a blow. Whether this is due to the fungus undergoing an explosion or release of the pressurized gas, say due to fermentation, is less clear. There's a final noteworthy point. In Heretics of Dune, which is a later book in the series, the Tlaxu managed to find a method of generating the melange artificially. This is that ultra spice we mentioned earlier. The ultra spice itself is not so important as how they do so. They were able to use their axolotl tanks, which are used to generate golas. Golas are a sort of clone. Where they're able to create a clone of the spice worm, they're also able to create one that is then modified. It not only lives in a purely aquatic environment, but produces a much more potent and concentrated form of the melange. From this, it's clear that melange can be created via a cloning vat, and to a certain extent, arguably synthesized, since the new variety is much more potent. If it was simply recreating the original spice, then we're left with certain problems as to how they are able to concentrate its effectiveness. Secondary to this is that it's noted in the book that they have been able to clone the sand trout, but not the melange fungus. This means we're not entirely clear as to whether or not the fungus and sand trout are entirely inseparable, are separate organisms living symbiotically, or if the fungus isn't necessary for the effect. It is entirely possible that the ultra spice is in fact an entirely different chemical that has the same impact. All of this so far has of course assumed that the image found in the Dune Encyclopedia is not the processed melange but the raw product fresh from the sand trout, that this structure by itself can be separated effectively and that individual components work the way they do. It's possible that through the processing and refinement of melange, the individual parts break up and reassemble to create entirely new products that aren't immediately obvious. Of course, speculating about just how you could rearrange this molecule in entirely new ways by processing it is well outside the scope of just speculation. That goes well and truly into the realm of rather advanced and, frankly, terrifying chemistry, and we'd rather not do that. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.